The workshop at the Hastings Center was fascinating. I never participated in something like that involved both practicing behavioral geneticists of a variety of different backgrounds as well as critics. It was fascinating, it was challenging at times, it was frustrating at times, but at the end it was really impressive, and I think that's the kind of thing that only the Hastings Center can pull off. So I really appreciated being a part of that, to then contribute an article to the special issue, and I was honored when Millie asked me to come and give a talk today, because the whole process has been fascinating. As the subtitle to my presentation suggests, what I want to do is give you a sort of field guide to the controversies that circle around the space of research on the genetics of intelligence. And so what I mean is, I want to give you a sense of the history of where they came from, a taste of sort of how they cluster, how some controversies sit together and how they're different from other controversies that are still in the same space. And then finally, I'll close by giving you what I take to be a couple of lessons as an outsider. I assume there are no practicing behavioral geneticists here, although even if there were, I think there are lessons for you as well. But as outsiders looking in on this space, ways to sort of guidance on how to think about it. So the history of research on the genetics of intelligence, both the science itself, the nature and nurture of the science itself, as well as the controversies, really starts with Francis Galton. He was the younger cousin of Charles Darwin, and just 10 years after Origin of Species, this isn't working. So basically, the rest of my slide it's jumping right ahead to the next slide. Any thoughts, Julie? Yeah, right. Could we just maybe minimize it? And then I can just ask you to flip through the slides. Yeah, go back to the second slide. Yeah, so what we'll have to do is I'll just have to ask you to go to each next slide. Okay. So in 1869, he publishes the book Hereditary Genius. And there's a sense in which this is the start of the nature-nurture debate. It's also in some sense the beginning of behavioral genetics as a discipline. What he did was tracked he identified what he took to be elements of genius, be they leadership, politics, arts, military, and then noted that these are passed down primarily in a small subset of British families. Not surprising, he was among them. I'll give you a taste of things to come. But in any event, the lesson was genius, the trait, is hereditary. By and large, it's nature and origin. And there are a couple features I want to just draw your attention to, because these are features that have come up again and again as we track this to the present. The first feature is, it is a study of difference. And I think it's important to kind of to recognize that, because it oftentimes gets mentioned, but it's essentially, genetics is the study of difference. And even before this, we don't even have the field of genetics yet. This is a study of difference. What Galton was doing was looking at differences in what he deemed to be in genius, and then tracking it through differences in heredity or differences in family trees. Okay, so that's one thing, it's a study of difference. And then the other feature is, they're studying difference for two reasons. One is just basic understanding. They want to know, how does this trait come about? Where, what is the origin? What is it the cause of it? Okay, so that's it's a basic understanding, a basic science question. But then the other reason that Galton is interested in it is intervention. He thinks maybe we can use this to shape the world and make it a place that we would like to see. And so right on page 1 of Hereditary Genius, he starts by saying, in the same way that breeders can select horses over time to be faster and faster, so it would be quite practical to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations, right? Now we can draw on this information to selectively breed for genius, okay? The product of that, we've heard eugenics several times today in the introduction earlier, in Millie's introduction, Eric mentioned as well. Galton is also the coiner of the term eugenics, okay? And this comes out of this research. The thought is we can now harness the science of human heredity to make the world a better place. That was his vision for it. But obviously, what it becomes, are things like involuntary sterilization, right? Anti-miscegenation laws, anti-immigration acts, right? Eventually what happens is people identify the fit and the unfit. Not surprisingly, the eugenicists, right, basically identify, what they look around is, this is what we are, and we're the fit, and the unfit are everybody else. And then they look to generate ways and employ technologies that will have more of the fit around and less of the unfit around. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? So then when we jump to the sort of track Galton's research over 100 years ago to what's going on now, that is really the history of behavioral genetics. When you look at that period, this will just quickly go through the portion that Eric talked a little bit about. That period of behavioral genetics when it was taking shape in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, much of what when they were talking about the genetics of intelligence at that time, what they're doing are twin adoption studies and generating measures, for example, heritability. So if you hear, the heritability of obesity is 80%, or the heritability of height is 90%, or the heritability of IQ is 80%. What they're saying is, we did these twin and adoption studies that Eric talked about and found that of the variation in the trait in question, IQ, 80% of that variation is attributable to genetic differences. Okay, and so lots of papers from that era, you can see things like, hard to read, comparison of the biometrical genetic, MAVA, and classical applications. What they're doing is basically talking about, here are different ways to measure this, and this is the results of those measurements. And so you get heritability scores in that period. As Eric also mentioned, starting in the 80s and 90s and then all the way up to the present, behavioral geneticists co-opt to develop in molecular genetics and then try to use those tools like linkage and association studies to find genes. This is now the gene hunting phase of human genetics generally, but behavioral genetics as well. A recent example of that, the paper in the upper right-hand corner, common genetic variants associated with cognitive performance. That was a published paper just last year by an interdisciplinary group. This is a study that Eric just talked about. Over 100,000 people included. They find three promising variants. Okay, there's a sense in which, wow, that's exciting. We found 3 promising variants. Another way to kind of phrase what Eric was saying earlier, if you take someone who's got the best possible combination of those variants, like I'm sure Eric does, and someone who I'm sure has the worst possible combination, and I'm sure I do, right? All that predicts is that the person with the best possible combination is going to have 2 IQ points more than the person who has the worst possible combination, right? So think about, with the promises of genes for intelligence in the 80s and 90s, right? The whole rug has been pulled out from underneath that. What we get are these, multiple variants that are just giving little bits, okay? But on the other, for the publishers of that paper, they were thrilled. They thought they found some intelligence genes, right? And now it's a matter of finding more and tracking and seeing how these go. Next slide, please. So when we put Galton on one side, and then research like we were just talking about, 3 promising variants for a very small effect size, the present next to each other, there's a sense in which that research is vastly different, right? So Galton he didn't have the concept of genes, let alone DNA with a double helical structure and amino acids. That was not, wasn't in his space of availability. Likewise, he never would have imagined that there could be a technology where you could actually take a human embryo, take a cell out and genetically test it for something ranging from Huntington's disease or one of the variants that were picked up in that 2014 study. Like that, for him, the technology was, hey, maybe we can selectively breed for genes, right? So there's senses in which the research that's being done now is quite different from what Galton envisioned. Next slide, please. But there's another sense in which it's very similar. And I'll go back to those features I mentioned at the end of hereditary genius. From Galton to the present, they're studying differences, right? They're doing genetics, and genetics is a science of differences. Galton was looking at how differences in genius track through differences in family trees, right? The group that published the paper last year, they're looking at how differences in what they call proxy measure for intelligence tracks through differences in these particular segments of DNA, studying differences, okay? And they're doing that for 2 reasons, like Galton. One, they're just interested in understanding. They want to know how the world works. But there's always this sort of sense of, and maybe we can use that to make the world a better place, right? In their vision of what the better place would look like. One of the papers that I flashed up from the earlier year in the 1960s was a paper by a man named Arthur Jensen. And at the very end of his paper, where he says, hey, heritability, intelligence has a high heritability, he says, this should be of great interest to educators. And he goes on to explain, basically, because now we know if heritability has an 80, or if IQ has an 80% heritability, now we know there's only really this little bit that educators can work with and shape, right? So he's basically hand-waving at social and educational policy in light of these genetic results. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the very quick, thumbnail sketch of the history from Galton to the present. Now what I want to suggest in these next couple slides is there's basically two general controversy clusters, I call them, that operate in this space. Okay? One controversy cluster revolves around questions of race, equality, and discrimination. In the 1960s, 1970s, it was known that there was an IQ gap. And what the IQ gap meant was there was, on average, a gap in IQ scores between black Americans and white Americans. About 15 points, one standard deviation, not insignificant. There was a very ready explanation for that IQ gap, and that's the stuff on the left. One of those populations had been exposed to things like slavery and segregated schools, right? And the other population had not, okay? And with that being identified as the cause, and environmental difference as the cause, a solution readily presented itself. We need to start making up for the fact that one of these populations has been systematically disadvantaged, okay? And so compensatory education programs like Head Start were set up to specifically address that issue, okay? 1969, Arthur Jensen, he's the guy that I just mentioned in the previous slide, comes along and suggests an alternative proposal. His proposal is, because IQ is heritable and highly heritable, it's in fact genetic differences that are accounting for the difference in races, not the environmental differences, okay? And in turn, right, this has a policy recommendation. There's no reason we should be spending all this money on things like Head Start. Racial groups are separated in part by genetic differences, and that's just a biological reality that you have to live with. And we should be constructing environmental educational programs that are tailored to these different kinds of people. Okay. This paper went all the way up to Congress. We had people arguing before Congress to pull funding for Head Start with this paper as the justification. Next slide, please. I would just want to emphasize here that this is not something that just happened back in the era of black and white pictures. This is not something that just happened decades ago, right? At least this controversy cluster, okay? Some of you may remember The Bell Curve, a book that was published in the 1990s, which basically rolled out very similar arguments to Jensen just 2.5 decades later, okay? But then in 2007, Jim Watson, Nobel laureate for co-discovering the double helical structure of DNA, past director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, is being interviewed by a reporter, and he says he's inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa because all our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all the testing says not really. He goes on to say, I wish blacks and white were equal, but people who have to deal with black employees find this not true. He was immediately condemned. He immediately backed off these comments. Fair enough. But still, the fact that a Nobel laureate, previous director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, prominent face of science, could misspeak in this way, right, shows that even in present, you've got people that operate in this space and can put these pieces together in such a way that see it this way. Okay. Next slide, please. So, in the first controversy cluster, then, there are sort of two issues at play. What's really frightening about that research is it looks as if it gives a biological justification for the thought that there are differences between the races, right? Okay, and then that's the understanding part of it. And then on intervention, it also suggests that because that's biological, we shouldn't try to use social forces to do anything about that inequality. It's a biological reality, right? A number of people have been critical of that idea. Outsiders, like one you're about to hear from, Dr. Roberts, I put her up there, as well as a number of other people. But I think it's also important to mention a number of insiders within that space of behavioral genetics were critical of it as well. And I'll just flag two, and I flag them because they were participants in the workshop, and they have papers in the supplement that you're looking at. So one is Irv Gottesman, he's to Dorothy's upper right. When Jensen's research was being rolled out in Congress and Senate to say we should be defunding things like Head Start, Gottesman went to Congress as a behavioral geneticist and said that is not what the genetics says. Okay, he's got a paper in the supplement. Eric Turkheimer, just below him, when Watson came out and said that the behavioral genetics that what genetics suggested was that policies that try to treat the races the same will work aren't. Turkheimer came out and said look, Watson may know a lot about the double helixal structure of DNA, right? But he doesn't know anything about, population genetics and, the biology of race and everything that revolves around this place. And so he really has an obligation to stay out of things that he doesn't know what he's talking about, okay? And so I think that's important to emphasize. He's got a paper in there as well, that, critics were coming from both inside and outside. Next slide, please. That's one controversy cluster. The other controversy cluster then tracks the more recent research that is gene hunting research. And the individual who best embodies this is a man named Robert Plomin, a behavioral geneticist in London. One of the two scientists who came to the Center for Talented Youth looking for access to their students. Okay, he's been doing behavioral genetics for a long time. In the early years, he was doing the stuff that I was talking about in the 60s and 70s. He was calculating heritability scores for things like intelligence. But more recently, he has really set his sights on finding genes for intelligence. Okay, and he's a part of that study that identified the 3 SNPs. Okay, to his credit, he has been very careful about trying to steer entirely clear of anything that looks like it gets to that previous controversy cluster about race, inequality, and discrimination. Next slide, please. But I want to be clear here. Even though in that slide, in the search for the 3 snippets, they don't say anything about race there, it doesn't mean that it isn't controversial. It's just it raises a different controversy cluster. Okay? So one of those controversies is about how it might be used. I think it's crazy to think that someone who could score, has an IQ score of 101 is more valuable and important than someone who has an IQ score of 99. We're talking about 2 IQ points here, right? Yeah, but think about a genetic counselor sitting with 2 parents, and they point to, the genetic counselor says that embryo is likely to have 2 IQ points more than that embryo. Who wouldn't implant the first one? And the concern here, and people have sort of called this a space of newgenics, because the thought is it's eugenics, but it's just branded in a new way, is that very act of sort of focusing in on these minor differences and then ranking people based on better and worse is eugenics all over again, okay? And then the other concern that's in this space, remember with the older genetics that Eric talked about, all they could do is say things like, well, we've got a heritability score of 80%, so genes are somehow involved in intelligence. But now with these new studies, right, we get particular stretches of DNA. They can say it's on this chromosome at this location, right? And they've got names like KNCMA1. And they can tell you what they do. They make proteins that are involved in neurotransmission, right? Now everything I just said is true. And also it's true that it makes up a very, very small portion of the variation in intelligence. But the concern is, and there's lots of social psych research on this, if you give just a whiff of a genetic explanation, people latch on to that and think that that is really the driver of differences, right? And think, as Eric mentioned, the whole push behind something like precision medicine, we're going to get all these genomes and get all these new genetic findings, right? Think about all the just environmental differences that are causing health discrepancies that get left out of that, right? The concern is that genetic findings like this, even if they only capture a minuscule portion of the variation, end up getting the attention and shape the way people think about this space because we're drawn to the kind of essentialistic explanation that genes provide us. And then last slide, please. So let me just then conclude. This domain of research is very charged. I think it's unusual that people look at this and think, right? They usually have some sort of negative or positive draw to it, or maybe it's some combination of both. Let me give you a couple of just what I take to be lessons. So for those of you who are inclined to be critical of this research, or in contrast, maybe there's a critical side of you, here's something that I think is important to keep in mind. You want to avoid lumping people who study the genetics of intelligence all together as if they're this one group of people, right? Someone like Jensen had no interest in molecular genetics. He was all about race differences. Someone like Robert Plomin is just hunting for genes and tries to steer completely clear of anything having to do with race. Eric Turkheimer, who Eric Perens mentioned, is a practicing behavioral geneticist, past president of the Behavioral Genetics Association, and thinks both of these things are crazy. He doesn't think you're going to find genes, and he thinks focusing on genetic causes of race differences is crazy. Okay? They're all studying the genetics of intelligence, but they're all doing it in very different ways. And so you want to be careful not to kind of say, oh, remember that stuff that Jensen did? Here comes Turkheimer, bad news, right? It's much more fine-grained on the ground. The other thing then, let's say you're inclined to be a defender or a promoter of this research, right? Or maybe you've got a side of you that's considering that option. One thing to keep in mind is you need to know that questions and concerns about race will always lurk at the edges of this research. So even if you're someone like Ploman who wants to say, I'm not interested in race differences, when we published this paper, we didn't look at anything about race, right? Race is just another difference that you can ask a question about. So when they find that gene, KNCMA1, that's a difference in intelligence, it's perfectly natural for someone who is interested in race to come along and say, let's see if there's a race difference in it, right? Do Asians, right, and blacks represent it differently? Let's run with this, okay? It's always at the edges. You can sort of hammer it out and say we don't do that, but it's not like it's somehow inherently different. It's just there. And then the other thing to remember is, even if you could take race completely off the table, there are other concerns about things like genetic testing for IQ that have nothing to do with race, which are still really, really controversial. Okay, and so it's, you know, I bring this up because you'll a lot of times hear people both within the behavioral genetics community or perhaps defenders of it will say, boy, if we could just make these, you know, crazy racists go away, everything would be smooth sailing, right? And the point is, no, it's not that smooth, right? You can't just make the race go away. It's always going to be at the edges. And even if you did, there's going to be other concerns about the race that's being done. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would just like to reiterate how wonderful that symposium workshop was at the Hastings Center, and I'm happy I could be a part of it and happy to be able to speak with you and have a discussion today. I am going to pick up where Jim left off with the idea of controversy clusters and ask whether it's possible to stay clear of those controversy clusters or even stay on the good side of them with research into the genetics of intelligence. In other words, my question is, can research on the genetics of intelligence be socially neutral? Right, so we've heard from everybody about the history of eugenics and the role that intelligence testing played in that history, and also that history didn't end with World War II. In fact, it had continued with work by people like Berkeley psychologist Arthur Jensen, who argued that black students' innate cognitive inferiority limited the efficacy of federal programs, so no point in spending money on them. And the controversial bestseller, The Bell Curve, where Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein made a very similar claim that race and class disparities stem from immutable, innate differences in intelligence, which could not be eliminated through social interventions. Now, most scientists studying the genetics of intelligence distance themselves from those, we saw from those researchers and commentators by arguing that they aren't biased like Herrnstein and Murray and Jensen and Galton. And so there's no need, they're not interested in studying differences between social groups, or they're not interested in supporting views that one group is more intelligent or superior to another. And so they argue that they can do this research while being socially neutral, and in fact could even help to reduce social inequities by doing the research, because what they find may help with interventions that can improve the social status of people who are harmed by bad education policy and other policies that promote social inequality. So I want to argue that research on the genetics of intelligence can't be socially neutral. And I have three main reasons for that. One is that the original and the ultimate purpose of intelligence testing is to gauge individuals' inherited capacity for certain social positions. That's the very purpose of it. It's not a consequence of it or a side goal. It's the purpose of doing it in the first place. Intelligence has social value. So research into the genetics of intelligence helps to identify an aspect of the inherited worth of individuals. And thirdly, genetic research on intelligence maps onto existing social hierarchies and stereotypes that, about intelligence that support those unjust social hierarchies. And I'm going to conclude that efforts to improve individuals' intellectual capacities or social mobility would be better served by nurturing the actual skills that intelligence tests are supposed to predict and generate, or that predict and that intelligence is supposed to generate. And more importantly, would be helped by more equitably distributing educational resources in our society. And all the evidence is that testing for the genetics of intelligence isn't going to improve the equitable distribution of educational resources in our society. In fact, all the evidence shows that it may hinder those efforts. So on balance, I don't think it's going to help. I would say we need better arguments for doing this research. Or at least the researchers should have to grapple with this. They can't say, I'm not a racist, I'm not a classist, I believe in equality, therefore my motive makes this research immune from these social concerns. So first, predicting intelligence is rooted in ranking people socially. The original purpose of mental tests was to determine individuals' fitness for social roles. As Jim so ably showed, Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, had a theory about the reason for the social order in England that he connected to genius. But he falsely confused inherited social privilege with inherited intelligence. He was looking at the privilege of people in England, and he wrongly assumed that the British elite achieved their stature owing to some innate genius. The aim of the first mental test center in London, established in 1882, was to demonstrate that scores matched social status. So in other words, intelligence testing became the linchpin for proving that social status was inherited, to scientifically legitimize the unequal social order and to justify intervening in a way that maintained that hierarchy. In the United States, the reification of intelligence as the primary indicator of human value facilitated the eugenics movement. It became the primary tool of eugenicists to test for intelligence. And eugenicists claimed that the IQ test could quantify innate intellectual ability in a single objective measure. The introduction of mental tests at the turn of the 20th century replaced physical measurements like cranial capacity as the means of ranking human beings in terms of supposedly innate inferiority and superiority. Now, we look back at those writings of Galton and other eugenicists, and we see this wasn't objective at all. You know, they said that Swedes were more intelligent than Italians. You know, so today's, oh, that can't possibly be. They were biased in what they were doing. But these tests weren't misused to support hereditary theories of social hierarchies. That was the reason they were created, to support those theories. Research on the genetics of intelligence was far from socially neutral when the very purpose of it was to confirm an unequal social order. Okay, so now today, scientists who use genetic theories of intelligence argue that research on the genetics of intelligence is devoid. By and large, you know, there are these people like Watson, they're outliers. And it's devoid now of eugenicist motives, and so can serve to objectively and scientifically identify people's intellectual levels without this social bias that the Watsons and the Galtons and the Jensens have. But genetic research into intelligence shares with eugenics a biological explanation for social inequality. Even if current studies aren't aimed at confirming a natural order of social groups, they still are aimed at producing biological information relevant to individual social positions. Why else do we care about measuring and predicting people's intelligence if it's not to determine how suitable they are for particular classrooms, vocations, and occupations? I mean, maybe the argument is, well, we'll intervene to make them more suitable for these classrooms, occupations, vocations, but the purpose of it is to figure out whether or not people have the capacity for these different social positions. Identifying genes that are associated with intelligence is a way of determining which people are predicted to have higher or lower intelligence based on biological differences. This doesn't mean that people's social roles will be used to predict their intelligence, as Galton did. He looked at the elite and said, oh, they must have genius. No, it's the opposite. But research on the genetics of intelligence is likely, if not inevitably, to be used to predict people's biological suitability for particular social roles. So it has a social purpose. I would say it inevitably has a social purpose to look for the inheritance of intelligence. Okay, secondly, intelligence has a social value. People who are deemed to be more intelligent are considered more socially valuable than people who are deemed to be less intelligent. So research into the genetics of intelligence helps to identify this aspect of inherited worth of individuals. The very meaning of intelligence can't be divorced from social values. As I think Eric pointed out, that there are multiple meanings of intelligence. So the IQ expressed in a single number that ranks people in linear order can't possibly measure the multiple types of cognitive function that human beings have. And so picking which kind of intelligence is going to be measured is a social decision. What kind of intelligence do we value, and are we going to say identifies the people who are suitable for certain positions in society? That itself, the very meaning of intelligence, is socially determined. So we know that mental tests underestimate many individuals' cognitive abilities, and in a socially biased way. Just like Galton, like Jim said, oh, well, of course, Galton was in the class of people who had genius. Well, come on. So the way that we measure intelligence reflects the values of the people who determine what intelligence is. And they're the powerful people. They're not the marginalized, disempowered people. So our society is deeply stratified along racial and class lines, which affect not only information children learn, but their very habits of thought, ways of thinking, and responses to stereotypes. All of that makes social stratification imported into intelligence testing. We know that mental test performances of groups improves with group social mobility. We can look at the increase in Jews' intelligence in the United States between the world wars, in some nations' intelligence, average intelligence since World War II, in the decrease in the mean IQ difference between blacks and whites over these same periods, to know that IQ is not immutable, but malleable and responds to social changes. In addition, the categories that people fall into based on their IQ will be ranked according to greater or lesser intellectual ability. Now, could it be that we would have a socially neutral, valueless ranking of people who are deemed to be more intelligent or less intelligent? Some researchers say, oh, this has no value. But before we could imagine that, we would have to strip away a century of cultural programming that equates intelligence with human worth and that degrades vocations associated with lower intelligence. We'd also have to strip away deep-seated stereotypes perpetuated for centuries that Black people are naturally less intelligent than whites. Even if it were possible to do that, there's reason to object to people being assigned to a classroom or occupation based on genetic predisposition, because predicting intelligence genetically divides people into categories that are likely to be valued differently. It will push against equally distributing resources to benefit all children. I mean, do we really believe that in our society we are motivated to devote extra resources to help those with lower intelligence? There's no evidence that we have such an unequal educational system now. Why is finding out about the genetics of intelligence is going to radically transform that? Why would it? Most taxpayers oppose paying more for people who are already deemed to be less intelligent. So finding the gene for it is all of a sudden going to make them motivated to spend more money? Why? The evidence is it's going to make them less motivated, because they will say, what's the point? We know that, again, from history. All right, so intellectual enhancement programs are more likely to address social disadvantages if they nurture the actual desired skills or behaviors that intelligence is supposed to predict, that IQ tests are supposed to measure, and that genes are supposed to predict. Why do we need genes or IQ testing even to do that? Okay, now, in the past, intelligence testing legitimated race and class hierarchies in explicit terms. Today, research on the genetics of intelligence, even if it doesn't use social classifications, maps onto these existing hierarchies and stereotypes. As you mentioned at the very end, it's inevitable. We have to confront the fact that dominant US society is marked by these long-standing, widespread, and deeply embedded assumptions about inherited intelligence of social groups. And social psychologists, the studies come out virtually every month by people like Jennifer Eberhardt, MacArthur Genius Award winner, showing that teachers today continue to treat Black children differently based on implicit stereotypes about them as less intelligent, more troublemakers, less able to achieve. For many Americans, evidence that intelligence is inherited supports this view. Their view that racial differences in intelligence must be inherited. Even if researchers don't use race as a variable and have no interest or expectation of finding race-based genetic differences, their findings will be interpreted in this influential social context. So given this powerful backdrop of racist and classist notions and gendered notions of intelligence, we still see research claiming to show that women don't do well in science because of the shape of our brains or our genes. It's impossible to conduct research on the genetics of intelligence without risking its use to support these racist stereotypes. So in conclusion, the belief that intelligence is heritable and can be predicted by tests has legitimated unjust social hierarchies and justified social policies designed to maintain them in the very recent past. We don't even have to go back 50 years to find those arguments and their effect on actual social policies. There is no evidence that genetic tests for intelligence are necessary or will help to improve education of people from disadvantaged social circumstances. In fact, I would argue to the contrary, the genetic theory of intelligence will provide a justification for the very social structures that prevent the equitable sharing of educational resources. So the weight of the evidence from history, from biology, from philosophy, from ethics, is that research into the genetics of intelligence cannot possibly be socially neutral and, in fact, will intensify social inequities. Thanks.
as my slides are coming up, let me just start with two preliminary comments. One is I want to just say publicly what a pleasure it was to work with Eric Parents on this project. Eric is incredibly smart and thoughtful and a really great person, and it has been wonderful having him and his colleague, who's somewhere here, Josie Johnston, as part of our center at Columbia, and there, I've said it. Second, I want to offer you my apologies, because after I give this brief talk, I need to run, and I'm not going to be able to stay for the discussion session. So Eric will take responsibility for explaining to you why anything that I've said that seemed offensive actually meant something else. Okay, so I'm going to present to you, and it's important to understand it this way, Eric and my take on what came out of the workshop. These are not the conclusions of all 20 people who were in the room. We didn't ask people to vote as to whether they agree with these comments, and it's entirely possible that one or more of our participants might take issue with these. But in terms of the general tenor of the discussion and the essential consensus of the group, these are some of the things that we think we can fairly say coming out of the workshop. With regard to the state of research on genetics of intelligence today, you heard from the earlier presentation that the twin studies that have been done over the years suggest that there's a substantial genetic component to intelligence, but it's been really hard to identify any genes that have more than a very small contribution to make to this effect. And in the world of behavioral genetics, there's a lot of discussion of the, quote, missing heritability and where it's hiding. It's a little bit like the question of where's all the dark matter in the universe that should be there. We may find both of them hiding somewhere together in a corner somewhere. There is not a consensus, even among behavioral geneticists, on how effective the strategies that are being pursued today of searching with ever larger samples for alleles related to intelligence will turn out to be. Eric Turkheimer at the workshop pointed out, I think, very importantly, that as you increase sample sizes, which is the current strategy that researchers in this area are using, what it gives you is the power to detect ever smaller effects. So the likelihood that doing that is in fact going to materially increase the total amount of variance that is accounted for by these genes is small and based on a great deal of hope more than evidence. And since the underlying rationale for the approach to CTY in the first place by Plomin and his colleagues was based on an educational rationale that identifying those people with differential genetic propensities for high and low intelligence would allow compensatory strategies to be used for those people at the lower end of the spectrum. It's certainly not the case that we are ready today either to be able to identify such people, or if we did, that we would know what to do about it, much less the problems that Dorothy raises about whether we would really have the social will to implement approaches of that sort. There were, as I think both the talks that you've heard today illustrate substantial concerns about the social consequences of this line of research. It's important to say that no one advocated for prohibiting genetic research on intelligence. I don't think there was anyone in the room who would favor limiting scientific inquiry in any given area as a matter of policy, but there were a lot of concerns that were voiced. The stigmatizing effect on individuals, the impossibility, as you've heard already, of preventing someone taking whatever findings are generated and trying to apply them to group differences, the misinterpretation of the contribution of genes to group differences, and the presumption, certainly false presumption, that they represent fixed differences to the extent that they're based in genetics. Overall, the risk is that we will further disadvantage the already disadvantaged, and that was a potential outcome of which I think everyone was aware and wary. It is also important, I think, to say that although nobody advocated prohibiting such research, there was a good deal of sentiment in the room for placing the burden on researchers as far as expenditure of public funding is concerned for demonstrating the strength of the rationale and the likely outcome of their research. Given the doubts as to where research on the molecular basis of the genetics of intelligence is likely to go, the researcher who proposes to spend $3 to $5 million of our tax money on a study of this sort really should be able to persuade us as to why that's a valuable investment. If such research is going to take place, the participants in the workshop discussed how that research might be accomplished in such a way as to try to mitigate these risks. And the term that the group came up with to describe such research was trustworthy research. And it's important to emphasize that trustworthiness, as our work group adopted that term, implied something more than just scientific validity. Okay? It includes scientific validity, but it also implied that the groups who were most, and individuals who were most concerned about the potential negative impact of such research could be assured that efforts would be made to minimize that impact. So it's trustworthy in two senses. And there were three components that the discussion settled on with regard to ensuring trustworthiness, and I've listed them here, but I'm going to go through each of them separately. Awareness and sensitivity of the risk, valid approaches to design, and affirmative efforts to mitigate risk. So first, awareness and sensitivity. Even before a study is designed, the group believed, a prerequisite for doing this in a trustworthy way is for the researcher to be aware of the past misuse and the potential for future misuse of these findings. If not by sitting in a room like this and listening to people like Jim and Dorothy, then by whatever way is effective in producing that outcome. Researchers need to take such concerns seriously. They cannot be brushed off. In doing so, it will be helpful to the research community to examine their own personal biases with regard to these issues and the ways in which they may influence the preconceptions that shape their research. And the group noted that as a means to this end, engaging directly with the critics of such research, or those people who have concerns about such research, can be enormously helpful. And the example of the Human Genome Diversity Project was offered, I think, by Sarah Richardson. The Human Genome Diversity Project, you may recall, was an effort to sample populations around the world in order to get a sense of the diversity of the composition of the genomes in different populations, that raised enormous concerns among some of these groups with regard to the use that the data would be put to, either for commercial purposes or as a means of comparing groups and drawing conclusions about the superiority in one way or another of some of those groups compared with others. And the opposition essentially came close to shutting the project down. But the researchers involved, rather than circling the wagons, opened up the project to discussion with and input from these varied populations. And in what must have been a very difficult process for them, ultimately came to an accommodation with their critics, changed some of their focus and procedures, and committed to an ongoing collaboration in what's a model very worth study by anyone who's undertaking work in this area. Step two, once one is aware of these issues, involves a valid design of the study. Now this may seem simple, even simplistic, or obvious, but it's not as simple as it sounds. If group differences are the focus, and one must ask why group differences would be the focus, but if they are, groups have to be carefully defined. And just thinking about race and its fraught definition in contemporary times illustrates how difficult a process that can be. Sample sizes must be adequate and statistics rigorous. Again, that may sound obvious, but frankly, it isn't if you look at the literature in the field today. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of changing the paradigm of such research, environmental variables can't be ignored. Particularly when you're dealing with something like intelligence, where there's so much reason to believe that the way the milieu, the social context in which children are raised has an enormous impact on their later intelligence apart from any contribution of their genes. The impact of environmental variables becomes critical to truly understanding variation in intelligence, if that's what you're interested in. Finally, proactive efforts, our group thought, should be taken by the researchers. They should assume this responsibility to mitigate the risk that their data will be misinterpreted. You've heard about the history and the extent to which findings, especially when they focus on differences between groups, will be misinterpreted as illustrations of inferiority of some groups or the uselessness of social or educational interventions. If it's inscribed in their genes, why should we even bother trying harder to help them to learn? Interestingly, models exist for dealing with this sort of problem, and I just want to tell you briefly about one of them. Jim showed you earlier the paper from the Social Science Genetics Consortium, which looked at educational attainment as a proxy for cognitive ability, and with an enormous sample of tens of thousands, did a GWAS, a genome-wide association study, to identify variants associated with higher educational attainment. They published their study actually in PNAS and not Nature. That's an error on these variants, and part of the message you've gotten so far is what a small amount of the variants, these three loci that they were able to identify, actually account for. But what you haven't heard yet is something else which is, I think, noteworthy about this project. Prior to publishing their major findings, the consortium put together a paper that was written in plain language for a non-scientific audience and was published as part of the supplemental materials in PNAS. You can find it on the on the website, linked to the article, that explained how not to misinterpret their findings, why they had not found the gene for, or 3 genes for educational attainment, why it was premature to draw policy or educational implications from this work. If you aren't familiar with what they did, it's worthwhile tracking it down and taking a look at it. And there's no reason why every behavioral genetics research group working in sensitive areas like this shouldn't do something similar. So we, at least Eric and I, left the workshop feeling that the discussion, the 2 days we spent there, had been enormously productive in identifying a set of approaches for researchers that both they and we would find reasonable to mitigating the risks associated with this research, which seems likely to continue, if not here in the US or in the UK, and in China, where the Beijing's Genomic Institute, BGI, has announced a major effort to identify genes associated with intelligence. It's going to happen somewhere, and given that, it should be done in the way that minimizes the risks that have been so eloquently described to you this afternoon. And now it's up to the field to put these approaches into practice.